Thaddeus Crowell slammed his fist on the banker's desk so hard the inkwell jumped. "I don't care what the paperwork says," he said, his voice dropping to something quiet and deliberate, which was somehow worse than shouting. "You will call that note. Today." The banker, a thin man named Gerald Petch, who had never once in his life told Crowell no, looked down at the papers in front of him and said nothing. "Flint's behind on the interest. That's all I need." "He's 2 weeks behind, Thaddeus. 2 weeks. The man just came through a drought." Every man in this valley came through a drought. Crowell picked up his hat from the desk and settled it carefully on his head. Only some of them have the sense to know when they're finished. Gerald Petch signed the paper. He told himself later that he'd had no choice. He was wrong, but it was easier to believe otherwise. That single signature, scratched out in less than 4 seconds, would begin a chain of events that nearly destroyed an innocent man, exposed a decade of fraud, and proved once and for all that the people this valley had dismissed as worthless were the only ones worth a damn. If this is your first time here, welcome, and please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one, and it means the world to me to see how far these stories travel. Stories like this one don't end where you expect them to. Stay with me until the last word, because the turns ahead will surprise you. The winter of 1889 arrived without warning and without mercy. It came the way most hard things do, not as a single catastrophic event, but as an accumulation of small cruelties that wore a person down until they had nothing left to stand on. First the cold, then the wind, then 3 days of gray sky that produced no snow and no sunlight, just a flat, dead light that made the Wyoming plains look like the surface of the moon. Mabel Winslow had been walking for most of those 3 days. She was 29 years old, though she looked older around the eyes. She was a big woman, broad-shouldered, heavy-set, with a soft round face that had once been called pretty by people who meant it as a consolation prize. Her dress was wool, or had been before the hem shredded against 2 days of frozen ground. Her boots had soaked through somewhere around the second creek crossing, and her feet had gone from painful to numb to something that didn't register as feet anymore, just 2 distant objects she was obligated to keep moving. She had 31 cents in the pocket of her coat. She had a worn cloth bag over one shoulder containing a change of clothes, a small knife, a tin cup, and a letter of reference from a dry goods merchant in Cheyenne who had employed her for 14 months before his wife decided she didn't like the way Mabel organized the shelves. That was the reason given. The actual reason that the wife had caught her husband speaking to Mabel with something resembling respect, and had drawn her own conclusions, was not the kind of thing anyone put in writing. Mabel had learned not to be surprised by that kind of thing. She had learned a great many things over the course of her 29 years that she would have preferred not to know. She had learned that people looked at her body before they looked at her face. She had learned that a big woman asking for physical work made men laugh in a particular way, not the kind of laugh that meant something was genuinely funny, but the kind that meant they were establishing something, reminding themselves and everyone nearby of the correct order of things. She had learned that hunger made everything worse, but that pride, carefully maintained, made hunger survivable. She had not eaten a real meal in 3 days. Cedar Mercy appeared through the frost like something she'd imagined. A water tower first, then the outline of a church steeple, then the dark squares of buildings pressing up against the flat sky. She stood at the edge of the road for a moment and just looked at it, because it had been so long since she'd seen a town that she needed a second to confirm it was real. Then she put her head down and walked toward it. Copper Kettle Cafe sat at the corner of Main and Fletcher, which in Cedar Mercy meant it was near everything and convenient to nothing. It was a low building with fogged windows and a wood stove that was working hard enough that you could feel its warmth from 15 feet. Someone had painted a coffee cup on the sign above the door and given it a steam curl that looked more like a question mark. Mabel pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warmth hit her like something physical. For a moment she just stood there, her hand still on the door handle, her soaked boots dripping onto the threshold, and she let herself have that 1 second of pure animal relief before she straightened up and looked around. There were 8 or 9 people inside. Cowboys mostly, a couple of townswomen at a corner table, a man in a suit who appeared to be doing sums in a small notebook. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s, with iron gray hair pulled back tight and an expression that suggested she had seen everything twice and was tired of most of it. That was Dorothy Vance, who owned the copper kettle and ran it the way she ran everything, with efficiency and very little patience for complications. Mabel walked to the counter. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I'm looking for work. Dishwashing, cooking, anything in the kitchen. I don't need much if you can spare a meal and a place to sleep. I'll work a full day for it." Dorothy Vance looked at her. Not unkindly, exactly. But the way she looked, taking in the torn hem, the soaked boots, the bag over one shoulder, was the look of someone doing a calculation. "I've got enough kitchen help," Dorothy said. "Sorry. I'm a hard worker. I can cook, said I'm sorry." Dorothy turned back to the counter. From the table nearest the stove, one of the cowboys, a wide-faced young man, with a red kerchief around his neck, leaned back in his chair. "Maybe she's looking for work at the ranch," he said. "You know, moving hay bales." He looked at the man beside him. The man beside him grinned. Mabel felt the familiar flush move up the back of her neck. She had learned to control her face a long time ago. Whatever she felt, her face stayed level. "I can move hay bales," she said. She said it flat and direct, looking at the cowboy without any apology in it. "Can you?" The cowboy's grin flickered. He hadn't expected that. "Ma'am, I know what you meant." She picked up her bag and turned toward the door, because there was nothing else to do, and she had 31 cents and approximately 30 more minutes of daylight, and she needed to think. She almost didn't notice the man in the corner. He was sitting alone at the smallest table, the one near the window that nobody else wanted because the draft came through the frame. He was tall even sitting. She could tell that with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something hard. He was wearing a coat that had been mended at both elbows, and in front of him was a bowl of beef stew that was still steaming. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't looking at her the way the cowboy had looked at her, or the way Dorothy Vance had looked at her, or any of the other ways she'd learned to brace against. He was just watching, quietly, like a man who had learned that watching carefully was more useful than talking. As Mabel moved toward the door, she saw him push the bowl of stew to the edge of his table. "Ma'am." She stopped. "You forgot your supper." Mabel looked at the bowl. She looked at him. "That isn't mine." The man stood. He was even taller than she'd thought had to be 6'2" at least, with the kind of lean, worn build that came from years of outdoor work, rather than anyone's effort. He picked up his hat from the back of the chair and settled it on his head. "It is now." He dropped 2 coins on the table to cover the meal and walked out the door. Mabel stood there for a moment. The red-kerchiefed cowboy said something under his breath that she chose not to hear. Dorothy Vance was pointedly looking the other direction. The man in the suit had gone back to his sums. Mabel sat down at the small table near the drafty window. She ate the stew. It was the best thing she'd tasted in 3 days, which wasn't saying much and also was saying everything. She didn't cry. She had learned not to do that in public. But she pressed her fingertips against the edge of the table for a moment and took one long, quiet breath before she picked up the spoon. She did not know the man's name yet. She did not know that he had spent his last $2 on that meal, and that he'd been trying to decide for 20 minutes whether he could justify ordering a second bowl before he'd seen her walk through the door. She did not know that the bowl of stew she was eating had been intended to get him through the next 2 days. She only knew that somebody had looked at her in her torn dress and her soaked boots after 3 days of walking in 31 cents and being laughed at by a man with a red kerchief and had simply seen a hungry person. That was all. And somehow that was the most startling thing that had happened to her in years. His name, she learned the next morning, was Calder Flint. She learned it because he came back to the copper kettle the following day, and Dorothy Vance, who apparently had a more complicated moral code than her initial refusal suggested, had reconsidered overnight and offered Mabel 3 hours of breakfast kitchen work in exchange for a meal and permission to sleep in the storeroom. The storeroom was cold and smelled like flour and something Mabel couldn't identify, and it was the best night's sleep she'd had in 2 weeks. Calder came in at 7 in the morning, ordered coffee, and sat at the same table near the drafty window. He nodded at Mabel when she came through the kitchen door to clear a table. She nodded back. That was the entire conversation. It happened again the next day, and the day after that. By the fourth day, when Mabel came out with coffee and set it on his table without being asked, Calder looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read and said, "You remembered. You sit here every morning. You always order coffee before anything else." She set down the cup. "That's not memory. That's just paying attention." Calder looked at the cup, then at her. Most people don't bother. Most people are too busy making assumptions to pay attention. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the edges of one, controlled before it could get out. "Calder Flint," he said. "Iron Creek Ranch, 3 miles east." Mabel Winslow. She didn't add anything else, because there wasn't much else to add. She was a woman with 31 cents and a letter of reference, sleeping in a storeroom and working 3-hour breakfast shifts for her meals. The facts spoke for themselves. "You from around here?" "No." "Where then?" "East. Various places." He nodded, accepting that the way he seemed to accept most things without pressing, without the particular brand of prying that passed for curiosity in most small towns. "You working here permanent?" he asked. "Temporary." She picked up her tray. "Dorothy's generous, but she's got enough help come spring." She went back to the kitchen. She didn't think about the conversation again until later that week when she was washing dishes and heard Dorothy Vance say to someone in the dining room, "That Flint boy's going to lose that ranch before June." Crowell's been circling it for 2 years. Mabel's hands slowed in the wash basin. She didn't catch the rest of it, but she thought about Iron Creek and the man who sat alone at the drafty table every morning and ordered coffee before anything else. Over the following weeks, she learned what she could piece together from the fragments that drifted through the Copper Kettle's dining room. Iron Creek had been a decent ranch, once not large, but productive. Calder had inherited it from his father 8 years earlier, along with a manageable debt that should have been paid off by now. Then the drought came. 2 successive summers of failed grass had cut his herd capacity in half. He'd borrowed against the ranch to buy feed, which was the sensible thing to do, and then the second drought had cut what was left of his herd again. Thaddeus Crowell had been buying failed ranches throughout the valley for 5 years. He was patient and methodical about it. He would identify a rancher in trouble, wait until the debt was large enough to be crushing, then buy the note from the bank and call it in. The rancher defaulted, lost the property, and Crowell acquired it at a fraction of its value. It was legal. That was the thing about it that made Mabel's jaw tighten when she thought about it. It was legal, and it was also something else, a predator's strategy, patient and cold, targeting people who were already struggling. She didn't say any of this to Calder. She didn't say it because she barely knew him, and because it wasn't her business, and because she had enough of her own problems to concern herself with. But she thought about it. The afternoon Dorothy told her that the winter slowdown meant she couldn't keep paying even the kitchen arrangement. Past the 1st of February, Mabel sat on the back step of the Copper Kettle and looked at the frozen ground for a long time. She had extended her 31 cents into $3.20 through careful management. She had a slightly better coat than the one she'd arrived in. Dorothy had given her an old one, and her boots had dried out and been risoled by the town cobbler in exchange for a week of bookkeeping, which Mabel had done in the evenings after her kitchen shift. She was better off than she'd been. She was not well off. She was thinking through her options, going back to Cheyenne, trying the next town, seeing if the stockyards were hiring when the back door of the cafe opened, and Calder Flint stepped out with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one and sat down on the step beside her. She looked at the coffee. "You don't have to, I know." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Dorothy told me. She shouldn't have," she was concerned. "She's not good at showing it directly, so she tells other people." He looked out at the frozen yard. "I have a proposition." Mabel said nothing. She had learned that silence was the fastest way to let a person get to the point. Iron Creek needs someone who can cook for the hands, manage the winter provisions, and keep accounts. "I've been doing all 3 myself and doing all 3 badly." He paused. "Particularly the accounts. You're offering me a job." Wages, real ones, not meal exchange, he named a figure. It was fair more than fair for winter ranch work, though she suspected he was stretching what he could actually afford. Mabel looked at her coffee. I don't want charity. Good, Calder said. I'm offering wages because I need someone better at half these things than I am. That's not charity. That's just arithmetic. She looked at him sideways. He was staring out at the yard with the same expression he'd had when he pushed his stew bowl across the table, not performing generosity, not waiting for her gratitude. Just stating a fact and waiting to see what she did with it. 3 ranch hands? She asked. 2 full-time. 1 seasonal who might stay through March. What are your winter provisions currently? He told her. She did the math in her head. You're going to run short on salt pork by January unless you've got more in a cellar somewhere. There's a root cellar. It's mostly empty. How many head of cattle are in what condition? Told her that too. He told her without hedging or minimizing, which was either because he was naturally honest, or because he'd given up pretending the situation was better than it was. She suspected both. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. Then she said, all right. She stood up, picked up her bag, and handed him back the coffee cup. I'll need to look at your accounts before I agree to anything specific, she said. And I want to see the root cellar and the herd before dark. Calder stood, something that might have been relief moving across his face before he controlled it. Horses out front, he said. Iron Creek was not what she'd expected. She'd expected something beaten down, the way places looked when the people caring for them had given up. But Calder hadn't given up. That was clear the moment she rode through the gate. The fences were maintained. The barn roof had been recently patched with lumber that didn't quite match, but it was solid work. The house was plain but not neglected. The problem wasn't care. Problem was resources. There simply wasn't enough of anything: feed, money, hands, time, and he'd been stretching all of it past the point where stretching was enough. Mabel walked the root cellar with a lantern. She paced the barn. She looked at the herd in the fading afternoon light and asked Calder questions he answered without defensiveness, which impressed her more than she let on. That evening, she sat at his kitchen table with his account ledgers. The picture was worse than what she'd calculated from his description. Not disastrous, not yet, but heading there with the kind of steady, undramatic momentum that was harder to stop than a crisis, because a crisis forced action, and this just kept quietly worsening. She set down her pencil. You know about Crowell, she said. It wasn't a question. Calder was at the stove, heating water. He didn't turn around. Everyone knows about Crowell. He's bought notes from 3 ranches in the last 2 years. 4. She looked at the ledger. Your note comes due in full in March if you miss the February payment. I know. Do you have the February payment? A pause. Not yet. She looked at the numbers for another moment. Then we need to talk about the herd, she said. He turned around. You're carrying 17 head that won't breed and aren't strong enough to bring a good price in spring, she said. You need to sell them now while you can still get something for them, and use that money to carry the breeding stock through to April. You also have 3 separate root cellars on this property, and you're only using one of them. That needs to change before the end of the week. Calder set down the water kettle and looked at her. The feed I've got won't stretch to April, he said. It will if you're not feeding animals that won't survive to April anyway. She said it plainly, without cruelty. I know it feels like giving up on them. It isn't. Protecting what can survive. He was quiet for a long moment. Crowell will hear I'm selling off animals, he said. He'll take it as a sign the ranch is failing. Crowell already thinks the ranch is failing, Mabel said. Question is whether he's right. Something in Calder's expression shifted. Not the control breaking, more like the weight of being the only person who knew the whole truth of a bad situation, and suddenly not being that person anymore. All right, he said. Tell me the rest, she told him. She told him about the rationing schedule she'd worked out, the order in which provisions should be drawn down, the way the second root cellar could be converted into cold storage within a week with the right preparation. She told him about moving the strongest breeding stock into the canyon pasture she'd seen from the road, where the hills would cut the worst of the wind. She talked for 40 minutes without stopping. When she finished, Calder sat across the table from her and was quiet for a moment. That's more planning than I've done in 3 months, he said. You've been too close to it. It's harder to think clearly when you're also scared. He looked at her. Who said I was scared? You didn't have to. She closed the ledger. Everyone who's about to lose something they care about is scared. Nothing wrong with that. The wrong thing would be letting it stop you from thinking. He held her gaze for a second. Then he said, Room and board are in the back. Small, but it's warm. I've been sleeping in a storeroom, Mabel said. Small and warm sounds like luxury. She started the next morning. She started the way she started everything, by making a list of what existed and what was needed, and then working through the gap between them with whatever was available. She was in the kitchen before first light, and the first ranch hand, a young man named Pete, 19 years old and perpetually startled-looking, came in to find the stove going and a breakfast on the table that was, in his words, repeated to Calder later that morning, not anything like what we usually got. What they usually got, she gathered, was whatever Calder could manage between doing everything else. What she made was substantial, hot, and calibrated to get hard-working men through a long, cold morning without flagging. She cooked the same way she did everything, practically. No flourish, no performance, just enough of the right things done correctly. Calder came in from the barn at 6:30, stopped in the kitchen doorway, and looked at the table. You didn't have to do all this, he said. I know, Mabel said. She handed him a plate. Eat before it gets cold. Word traveled the way word always traveled in small towns, faster than anyone intended, and with its own editorial additions along the way. By the end of the week, when Cedar Mercy's Main Street saw Calder loading 17 cattle into a transport on his way to the stockyards, the story had already gotten ahead of him. Flint selling off his herd his big new cook told him to. The woman from the cafe? That's the one. When Thaddeus Crowell heard it, and Crowell heard everything, because Crowell paid the particular privilege of hearing everything, he was in the middle of a meeting with 2 other ranchers, whose land he had not yet acquired but was patient about. He let a smile move across his face. Well, he said, at least Flint's finally making peace with the situation. One of the other men said, Think he knows it's over? He does now, Crowell said. His big woman from the cafe told him so. He said it with a particular kind of amusement, the kind that assumed dismissal was a form of summary. The woman was an object of ridicule, therefore her advice was ridiculous, therefore any plan built on her advice could be ignored. He was wrong about that. He would not know how wrong for several months. The ranch hands adjusted to Mabel the way men usually adjusted to competence, reluctantly at first. Then with the ease that came from simply noticing that things worked better. Pete was the fastest, because Pete was young enough that he hadn't yet accumulated the particular kind of pride that made men resist taking direction from women. He watched Mabel reorganize the storeroom on her 3rd day and asked, without any of the edge the older cowboys sometimes used, why she was moving things that specific way. Explained. He listened, he helped. The other full-time hand was a man named Roy, 52 years old, originally from Missouri, who had been working cattle since before Mabel was born and had opinions about most things that had been calcified in place for approximately 30 years. Roy did not say anything rude to Mabel. He simply operated on the assumption that her ideas would be tried, fail, and be abandoned, at which point things would return to the way Roy understood them to be correct. This was not rudeness exactly, it was just a theory. The theory started having problems around the end of the 2nd week, when Mabel's rationing schedule proved to be extending the feed supply by enough that Calder was able to hold back money that he'd expected to spend immediately. Roy, to his credit, adjusted his theory. You know, he said one morning, watching Mabel carry a feed sack across the barn floor that he would have needed Pete's help with. Most women I knew back in Missouri couldn't do that. Most women I know in Wyoming couldn't do that either, Mabel said pleasantly. She set the bag down. That's not really about being a woman. That's about being used to hard work. Roy considered this for approximately 8 seconds. Huh, he said. That was the end of Roy's doubts. It was Calder who told her about Crowell's comment. He told her the way he told her most things directly and without softening, because he had learned quickly that she didn't want things softened. They were at the kitchen table going over the week's accounts, a ritual that had developed naturally and now happened every Sunday evening. Crowell said what? She asked, keeping her voice level. That his big woman from the cafe told him what to do. Calder looked at the ledger. He meant it to be dismissive. I know what he meant. I want you to know what you said when he did it matters more than what he said, Mabel said. What did you say? Calder was quiet for a moment. I said that woman has more sense than every man laughing at her. She held very still. She did not let herself look at him, because she was not ready to examine whatever she felt about that statement in the middle of a Sunday evening accounting session. Good, she said. She made a mark in the ledger. Now tell me about the canyon pasture. Is the fence line holding? The days settled into a rhythm, and rhythms were things Mabel was good at. She was good at them because
she'd spent most of her adult life being the person who established rhythm for
other people.
In other people's kitchens, other people's businesses, other people's lives.
She was the person who arrived and made things run, and then left when the arrangement ended, and the rhythm continued for everyone else, while she packed her bag and moved on. She had stopped expecting it to be different. But there was something about Iron Creek that was different, and she could feel it in multiple ways that she didn't quite allow herself to name. It was the way Calder asked her opinion, and then actually waited for the answer. Not waiting for her to finish so he could say what he'd already decided, actually waiting. It was the way the kitchen had begun to feel like her kitchen, not because anyone had said so, but because she had arranged it the way she would have arranged it if it had been hers, and nobody had rearranged it back. It was the evening that Calder came in from a long day of fence repair in the bitter cold, sat down at the kitchen table without speaking, and she set a plate in front of him and sat across from him with her own. And they ate dinner together without saying anything, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just two tired people eating at the end of a hard day, and the silence was the easy kind. She noticed all of this. She noted it carefully, the way she noted discrepancies in account books. She did not let herself think about what it meant. 3 weeks into February, Calder rode into Cedar Mercy and came back with a face that told her something had happened before he said a word. She was in the root cellar when she heard him come through the gate. She came up the steps with a lantern and looked at him. Crowell bought the note, Calder said. She set the lantern down on the fence post. When did the bank sell it? This morning. Gerald Petch. Something moved across Calder's face that wasn't quite anger, it was past anger, into something darker and flatter. I was 2 weeks behind. That's all he needed. How long do you have? 30 days. Crowell gave me 30 days to come up with the full amount or surrender the deed. Full amount was not possible. She knew that. He knew that. The rationing and the sale of the 17 head had bought them breathing room. Not a miracle. Picked up the lantern. All right, she said. Mabel minus. Let me think. She wasn't sharp about it. She just needed to think, and she thought better when she was moving. So she walked back toward the house and went inside and stood in the kitchen with the lantern on the table and the numbers arranging themselves in her head the way they always did when she let them. Calder came in and stood in the doorway. She looked at the ledger on the shelf. Can I look at those contracts? She asked. The original ones. The ones that established the note terms with the bank. Why? Because Crowell has done this 4 times before, and I want to understand how. He got her the contracts. She sat down at the kitchen table with the lantern pulled close, and she started to read. She read carefully, the way she'd learned to read contracts back east, when she'd kept books for the merchant slowly, with attention to the specific words and the specific numbers, because the space between what a document said and what it appeared to say was where the trouble always lived. She was on the 3rd page when something stopped her. It was a small thing, a number that didn't match another number on a different page. An interest calculation that was 3.5% higher than the original rate agreed to in the opening terms. She sat with it for a moment. Then she turned back to the 1st page and read it again. Calder, she said. He was at the stove. He turned around. Come look at this. She didn't say anything definitive that night. She wasn't ready till she needed to see more, and she needed to be certain before she said a word to anyone, because certain was the only version of this that helped. She sat at that table until midnight, going through every page of the contracts with the precision of someone who had learned to find the mistake in a column of 50 numbers because missing it had consequences. There were 3 discrepancies in Calder's contracts as a loan. Small ones. Not the kind of thing a rancher focused on cattle and weather and the day-to-day labor of survival would be likely to catch. Just numbers, slightly off. Interest rates that shifted between documents. Calculation that totaled incorrectly in a particular direction. Always in the same direction. Always in favor of the creditor. She thought about the other 4 ranches. She thought about Gerald Petch at the bank, and the look she'd heard was on his face. When Crowell's name came up, she thought about Crowell's patience, that deliberate, methodical waiting. Closed the ledger. She sat in the dark kitchen for a while, thinking. She thought about how she had spent her whole life being dismissed. About what it meant to be dismissed. About the strange, specific advantage of being the person everyone forgot to worry about. When Calder came back downstairs at 1 a.m. because he couldn't sleep, he found her still at the table with the contracts in front of her and an expression he couldn't quite read. "What did you find?" he asked. "Possibly nothing," she said. He sat down across from her. "And if it's not nothing?" She looked at him. Then she said carefully, "We're going to need to look at those other 4 ranches." He held her gaze. Outside, the wind had picked up again, and somewhere across the frozen valley, a storm was building, the kind of storm that would, within the next 2 weeks, become the worst blizzard in 20 years. Kind that would scatter cattle and freeze a man to the ground and force a woman whom everyone had underestimated to make a choice about what she was willing to risk. But that was still 2 weeks away. Tonight, in the kitchen of a struggling ranch that was still standing, the woman everyone had laughed at sat across from the man who had given her his last meal, and between them was a piece of paper that might mean nothing. Or might mean everything. She didn't sleep that night. Not because the room was cold, though it was. Not because the wind was loud against the single window of the small back room that had become hers over the past weeks, though the wind was doing its best. She didn't because her mind was doing the thing it did when it found a problem worth solving, turning it over and over, looking at it from every angle, refusing to set it down until she understood its shape completely. She got up before 4 and went to the kitchen and lit the stove. By the time Calder came downstairs at 5:30, she had made coffee and written 3 pages of calculations in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She had also, in the space between one calculation and the next, made a decision that she wasn't entirely sure was wise, but that she was entirely sure was necessary. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept some." He looked at the 3 pages of calculations on the table. He looked at her face. He had learned, in the weeks she'd been at Iron Creek, that her face communicated more information than most people's faces. If you were paying attention, and he had gotten into the habit of paying attention. "Tell me," he said. He poured himself coffee and sat down. "I need to see the contracts from the other ranches," she said. "The 4 that Crowell already took. I need to compare the interest calculations against their original note terms." Calder was quiet for a moment. "Those contracts are in county records. You'd have to go to the clerk's office in Harding." "How far is Harding?" 14 miles. Half a day by horse." "Can you get me there tomorrow?" He looked at her across the table. "What do you think you're going to find?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the honest answer. I found discrepancies in your contracts 3 separate places where the numbers don't line up with the original agreed terms. It might be clerical error." She paused. "It doesn't look like clerical error." Because clerical errors go in both directions. These all go in the same direction." Calder set down his coffee cup. She watched him work through it, not slow, just careful. He was a man who did not rush his conclusions, which she had come to understand was not a limitation but a discipline. "If it's not clerical error," he said, "then Crowell has been inflating debt on ranches that weren't actually in default. Creating default conditions that didn't exist in the original terms." She folded her hands on the table. "Which means the notes he bought and called in were based on fraudulent numbers." Kitchen was quiet except for the stove. "That's a serious thing to say," Calder said. "I know it is. That's why I need to see the other contracts before I say it to anyone else." He nodded slowly. "I'll get the wagon ready for tomorrow morning." "Can ride," Mabel said. "I don't need a wagon. It's 14 miles in February." I've walked 30 in February. I can ride 14. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile again. That controlled thing that happened at the edges of his expression sometimes. All right, he said. We leave at first light. Harding was larger than Cedar Mercy, which was not saying much. It had a proper courthouse, a 2-story hotel, and a main street wide enough that 2 wagons could pass without either driver having to do anything dramatic. The county clerk's office was in a building attached to the courthouse, run by a man named Arthur Blaine, who was 60 years old and had the particular energy of someone who had been organized their entire life and was very tired of dealing with people who hadn't been. Mabel told him she needed to review the records of property transactions involving Iron Creek and 4 named ranches over the past 5 years. Arthur Blaine looked at her over the top of his eyeglasses. Those are public records, he said, in a tone that didn't argue this point, but wanted her to know he was aware of it. I know, Mabel said. That's why I'm here. He got her the files. She sat at a long table in the back room of the clerk's office for 4 hours. Calder sat with her for the first hour, then went and stood outside, because he was a man who moved better than he sat still, and the narrow wooden chair was making his back ache. He came back every 30 minutes to check on her progress. She barely looked up when he came in. She was reading the way she read when she was certain something was there with that focused, methodical patience that blocked out everything else. She had a page in her notebook where she was copying specific numbers. She filled 1 page, started a second. The 3rd time Calder came back, it was past noon and she was on her 5th file. Mabel, give me 20 minutes. He left and came back with 2 sandwiches he'd bought from the hotel dining room. He set one beside her without saying anything. She ate it without looking away from the document in her hand. At 2 in the afternoon, she closed the last file and sat back in her chair. Calder, who had pulled a chair to the corner of the room and found a way to half doze while still technically remaining upright, straightened up and looked at her. Her face told him something before she said a word. All 5 ranches, she said. Her voice was very level. Every single one. The interest rates in the county records don't match the interest rates in the called notes. In every case, the called-in amount was higher than what the original terms established. Calder was very still. How much higher? Enough. Not so much that you'd catch it without looking carefully at both documents, side by side. But consistent. Always the same pattern. She tapped the notebook. This isn't bookkeeping error. Someone with access to the documents altered them after the original signing. Can you prove that? Not alone. She closed the notebook. I need someone who knows contract law and property records. A lawyer or a county authority with standing. She paused. And I need to be very careful about who that is, because Crowell has been operating in this valley for 5 years without anyone stopping him. Which means either nobody caught it, or somebody with standing caught it and decided not to care. Calder stood up. Gerald Petch, he said. Possibly. I don't know how far the cooperation goes. She met his eyes. I want to be clear about something. What I have right now is evidence of discrepancy. It points very strongly toward fraud. But pointing towards something and proving it are different things. And if we move too fast or say too much to the wrong person, Crowell will know we're looking. And then the documents might not be where they are now. Calder was quiet for a moment. So we say nothing. We say nothing. We keep working. We make the February payment if we can. I have an idea about that, and we buy ourselves more time while I figure out the right person to take this to. She stood, gathering the files back into their order for Arthur Blaine. Can you trust Roy and Pete to keep this between themselves? Roy doesn't talk. Pete talks to his horse. Good enough. The ride back to Iron Creek was cold and mostly silent. Not uncomfortable silence. She and Calder had gotten past the stage where silence needed filling. They rode side by side on a road that was more frozen mud than anything else, and the sky was turning the color pewter by the time the ranch gate came into view. Pete was at the fence with a worried look on his young face. What happened? Calder called out. Nothing bad, Pete said quickly. Mr. Alderman came by, from the Double Pine. He left a message, says he needs to talk to you. Sounded important. Calder and Mabel exchanged a look. Frank Alderman ran the Double Pine Ranch, 3 miles north. He was one of the 5 ranches she'd pulled records for that afternoon. Crowell had taken the double pine 18 months ago, and the Alderman family had moved into a rented house in Cedar Mercy, Frank working day labor at the stockyards while his wife took in washing. "Tell him I'll come tomorrow morning," Calder said. Frank Alderman was 56 years old and looked 70. Not in the way that most hard-lived men of that era looked older than their years. This was something else. The specific weariness of a man who had worked something his entire life and then watched it be taken from him by machinery he didn't fully understand and couldn't fight. He came to Iron Creek the next morning before Mabel had finished the breakfast dishes. Calder brought him to the kitchen table, which had become, without any formal decision, the place where serious conversations happened at Iron Creek. Mabel poured coffee and moved to leave the room. "You can stay," Calder said. Frank Alderman looked at her. He'd heard about her, she could tell, from the particular way he adjusted his expression when he saw her, that he'd heard some version of the red kerchief cowboy's assessment. But he was also a man who had lost too much to bother with the luxury of dismissal. "Heard you're looking at Crowell's records," Frank said. He was talking to Calder, but he kept glancing at Mabel. Calder said nothing. He picked up his coffee. Frank put both hands flat on the table. "I want to know if what you're hearing is what I think you're hearing. Because if it is," he stopped, started again. "We never missed a payment. Not once, in 15 years on that land. When Crowell bought the note and called it in, I sat with 3 different lawyers trying to understand how he had the standing to do what he did." His jaw tightened. 2 of them told me the numbers were right and I just hadn't understood my own contract. One of them told me there might be a problem, but that pursuing it would cost more than I could afford. Kitchen was very quiet. Mabel set down her coffee cup. "Mr. Alderman," she said, "do you still have your original contract? The one you signed when you first borrowed against the property?" Frank reached inside his coat and set a folded, worn document on the table. She had expected he might. A man who had sat with 3 lawyers trying to understand what happened to his ranch was a man who kept his paperwork. She unfolded it carefully. She found the interest rate clause on page 2. She compared it to the number in her notebook from yesterday's records at the county clerk's office. The difference was 4.25%. She showed it to Calder without speaking. He looked at the 2 numbers. He looked at her. Frank Alderman watched both of them. "What does it mean?" he asked. Mabel refolded the document and placed it in front of Frank with both hands flat on top of it. "It means," she said, "that you are going to keep this somewhere very safe. And that I need you to tell me if any of the other families still have their original contracts." Frank stared at her. 3 of them might," he said slowly. "Beaumont family kept everything. Old man Beaumont kept records like his life depended on them." "Good. Can you reach them without it being obvious?" "Can try," he paused. "Who are you taking this to?" "I don't know yet. I need someone with authority and no connection to Crowell. That's a shorter list than it should be in this county." Frank sat with that for a moment. Then he said, with a rawness that had been worn smooth by too many repetitions, "We built that place over 30 years. My wife's hands put up those fence posts. My son was born in that house." He stopped. Nobody said anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would fix that. The damage was done. What remained was what could be done about it, which was a different and smaller thing, but still a thing worth pursuing. "We'll do what we can," Mabel said. It wasn't a promise of success. She was too careful for that. But Frank Alderman nodded like it was something solid, because honesty, when it came from a person who clearly meant it, had a weight to it that comfortable reassurances never quite achieved. The February payment. That was the immediate problem, and Mabel had been working on it in the space between everything else. The idea had come to her the same night she'd stayed up with the contracts, in one of those sideways moments where your mind produces a solution from a direction you weren't looking. Iron Creek's kitchen had been feeding 2 ranch hands and Calder through the winter. But what it could feed, with the right organization, was considerably more than that. The cattle drive season would begin in early spring, and the ranches and drovers passing through this stretch of Wyoming would need provisions, preserved meat, dried goods, packed meals for the trail. There was no one currently providing that in any organized way between Cedar Mercy and the next town north. She brought it to Calder on a Wednesday evening, laid out in specific terms, what she could produce, what she'd need to invest, what she estimated she could charge, what she estimated they could clear by the end of February. Calder looked at the numbers. This assumes we have buyers, he said. I've already spoken to 2 drovers who come through the Copper Kettle regularly. One of them said he'd been looking for a reliable provision source for 2 years. She set her pencil down. I need $20 for supplies. The return should be at least $70 before the end of the month. You've already talked to the drovers. I wasn't going to bring you a plan that didn't have customers. He looked at her for a moment. When did you have time to do all this? Mornings, before you're up. He had that controlled smile thing happening again at the edge of his expression. She has noticed that it appeared specifically when she said something that surprised him, and it was becoming harder to not notice it, which was an inconvenient development. $20, he said. Yes. He opened the tin box where he kept the working cash and counted out $20 and pushed it across the table. Pocketed it. I'll need Roy to help me with the smokehouse next week, she said. Roy will be available, and I need the second roots cellar finished by Friday. Pete and I will do it Thursday. She nodded. She started to gather her papers. Mabel. She looked up. You know you don't have to save this place, Calder said. It wasn't said with self-pity. It was the same flat honesty he used for most things. That's not what I hired you for. She held his gaze. I know that, she said. Then because it's worth saving. She said it simply, without any elaboration, and went back to her papers. Calder sat across from her and said nothing else. But she was aware of him sitting there, and she was aware of the specific quality of his silence, and she was aware that she had answered the question honestly, without fully examining what she meant by it. She preferred not to examine it right now. There was too much else to do. Crowell came to Iron Creek on a Thursday. He didn't announce himself. He rode in through the gate mid-morning, 2 men with him, who wore the particular expression of men paid to stand nearby and look significant. And he tied his horse at the fence and walked to the house, like he was already considering where he'd put the furniture. Mabel was in the root cellar when she heard the horses. Came up the steps with a jar of preserved salt pork in one hand and saw Crowell standing at the porch. He was a big man, Crowell, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago, and was now the face of a man who had gotten most of what he wanted and found the wanting more satisfying than the getting. He dressed better than the other ranchers, which was the kind of detail that communicated exactly what it was meant to. He looked at Mabel. She could see him categorizing her, taking in the heavy boots, the work apron, the jar in her hand, and making the same set of calculations that men like him always made. This the cook? He said to one of his men, not to Mabel. His man. Mabel walked past him to the porch step. Mr. Flint is in the north pasture. I can send for him if you'd like to wait. She said it with the exact level of courtesy that the situation required, and not 1 degree more. Crowell looked at her with a kind of amused assessment. You're the woman he's been taking advice from, he said. About the ranch. I manage the provisions and accounts, she said. Manage the accounts. He repeated it the way some men repeated things they found implausible. That's ambitious for a... He paused, and the pause itself contained the sentence he'd decided not to finish. For a what? Mabel said. Not with heat. With simple directness, she just completed the question and looked at him steadily. Crowell smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that had probably worked in a lot of rooms. For someone who just arrived. I've been here 2 months, she said. Is there something I can help you with while you wait for Mr. Flint? Just paying a neighborly visit. He looked around the yard with the kind of proprietary attention that communicated his actual purpose far more clearly than any words. I wanted to see how things were progressing, given the circumstances. Things are progressing well, Mabel said. Something shifted in Crowell's expression, just briefly, the practiced pleasantness slipping enough to show what was underneath. Heard you sold some cattle, he said. We did. Strategic reduction. The breeding stock is in excellent condition. Heard the provision sales are keeping you afloat. She looked at him steadily. We're meeting our obligations. For now. He said it comfortably, like a man stating a weather pattern. 30 days is 30 days, Miss Winslow, she said. Mabel Winslow. Miss Winslow. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be condescending even for a hat gesture. I'll wait for Flint. Calder arrived 20 minutes later. Mabel watched the two men talk from the kitchen window. While she worked, she couldn't hear what was said, but she could read the body language well enough. Crowell was relaxed, expansive, the confidence of a man who believed the ending was already written. Calder was still, contained, the particular stillness of a man who was listening carefully. When Crowell rode out, Calder came to the kitchen. He offered to take the land and let me stay on as a hired hand, he said. Mabel was at the stove. She didn't turn around. And what did you say? Told him I'd have the payment in 30 days. He believe you? No. Good, Mabel said. Let him think it's impossible. Overconfident men stop watching carefully. She heard Calder lean against the doorframe. He said something about you, Calder said. I know what he said. She turned around. Don't tell me. It won't change anything and it'll just make you angry. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression that she noticed and filed carefully in the part of her mind she wasn't currently examining like Zim. All right, he said. Wash up, she said. Lunch is ready. The provision business worked better than she'd projected. Not by a large margin, this was Wyoming in February. Not a fairy story, but by enough. The first drover took 3 weeks of preserved meat and packed provisions and paid her in cash on delivery and told 2 other drovers before the week was out. A general store in a town 8 miles north placed a standing order for her salt preserves after their own supplier went dry. Pete rode deliveries while Roy helped with the smoking and packing, and Mabel worked the production end from before dawn until past dark most days. Her hands were cracked from the salt and the cold, and there was a bruise on her left arm from where a heavy shelf bracket had swung loose in the smokehouse, and she was sleeping less than she should have been. But by the 22nd of February, she set $43 on the kitchen table in front of Calder. He looked at it. We still need more, she said. But with what you have saved, we're close enough that I think I can make up the difference by end of month. Calder picked up the money. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it down and looked at her. Mabel. She was already back at the account book, pencil moving. Mabel, he said again, with a weight that made her stop. She looked up. He seemed to be working through something the same careful, unhurried way he worked through most things. But there was something in his face that was less controlled than usual. Nobody has ever, he started, stopped. I've been running this ranch alone for 3 years, since my father died. And I've been doing most of it wrong, and I knew I was doing most of it wrong, and I couldn't see clearly enough to fix it, because he stopped again. Because you were too close to it, she said. I told you that at the beginning. I know what you told me. He met her eyes. I'm trying to thank you. She looked at the money on the table. She looked at the account book. She looked at her cracked hands. Don't thank me yet, she said. We haven't won anything yet. We've just slowed down the losing. Calder picked up his coffee cup. Still, he said. She took the pencil and wrote a number in the account book and said nothing else. But she did not immediately look away, and that was something. Frank Alderman came back on a Friday evening with 2 other men. One was a Beaumont, the old man himself, 68 years old, lean and weathered, with a folder of papers under his arm that he set on Mabel's kitchen table, with the care of someone setting down something irreplaceable. The other was a rancher named Stills, whose family had lost their property 14 months ago, and who had driven 20 miles in the cold because Frank Alderman had told him it might matter. They sat around the kitchen table, 5 people in a room that was technically Calder's kitchen, though Mabel had long since stopped thinking of it that way, and she spread the documents across the surface and walked through what she'd found. She was careful. She was precise. She did not overstate what the documents showed, or what could be proven versus what was strongly indicated. Old man Beaumont listened without speaking until she finished. Then he opened his folder and placed his original contract alongside the county record number she'd written down. The discrepancy was immediately visible. He said nothing for a moment. His jaw moved once, like he was working through something. How did we not see this, he said. It wasn't quite a question. You weren't looking for it, Mabel said. You had no reason to suspect the county records had been altered. You were comparing your copy to what the bank was telling you, and the bank was Mainz. Working with him, Stills said, flat and certain. Possibly. I don't know the extent of it. But someone with access to the county record copies altered those numbers before Crowell called the notes. She folded her hands on the table. Which means the defaults he created were fraudulent. And the property transfers that followed from those vaults may not be legally valid. Kitchen was very quiet. Beaumont looked at his contract for a long time. My wife was born on that land, he said finally. Her father homesteaded it. Nobody had an answer to that. There's a circuit judge, Calder said. Judge Harlan Price. He comes through Harding 4 times a year. He's not from this county. He has no reason to owe Crowell anything. Mabel looked at him. When is he next through? 3 weeks. She did the math. 3 weeks was after Crowell's 30-day deadline on Iron Creek. She sat with that for a moment. Then we need to get to him before the deadline, she said. We need to protect Iron Creek's deed while the investigation opens, or Crowell will have the property transferred before Price can act. Can we do that? Frank asked. I don't know, Mabel said honestly. But I know what happens if we don't try. Beaumont closed his folder. He looked at Mabel across the table, with the particular attention of a man who had spent 68 years judging whether people were worth trusting. Who are you? He said. It wasn't hostile. It was a genuine question. I kept accounts for a merchant in Cheyenne, she said. Before that, I kept accounts somewhere else. I've been keeping accounts most of my adult life, and I know what numbers that don't line up look like. She paused. That's all. Beaumont looked at her for another moment. It's not all, he said. But all right. He stood, and the other men stood, and Mabel began rolling up the documents that needed to go back to the county records before anyone noticed they'd been looked at too carefully. Outside the kitchen window, the sky had turned a particular shade of gray that meant weather coming. Heavy weather. The kind that built slowly for days before it hit, gathering itself like something that intended to make a point. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, filed it, considered it, moved on. There was still work to do. The weather that had been building at the edge of the sky for 3 days finally made up its mind on a Tuesday. It didn't come all at once. That was the thing about the worst storms. They didn't announce themselves with drama. They arrived in increments, each one reasonable enough on its own, so that by the time you understood what you were dealing with, you were already inside it. Tuesday morning brought wind. Not the usual winter wind that moved across the Wyoming plains with a kind of indifferent persistence, but something with direction and intention, coming out of the northwest and dropping the temperature 10 degrees in 2 hours. By noon, the sky had turned the color of a cast iron skillet, flat and heavy and close. By mid-afternoon, the first snow was coming down light at first, the kind that melted when it hit the ground. Mabel noticed it from the smokehouse window and said nothing. She was in the middle of packing the last of a provision order due for pickup the following morning, and there was nothing to be done about weather except watch it and plan accordingly. Pete came in at 3 o'clock with snow on his hat brim and said, "It's picking up out there, Miss Mabel." I can see that. She handed him a wrapped parcel. "Get this in the dry storage before the moisture gets to it." "You think it'll be bad?" She looked at the sky through the window. The light was wrong, that particular flat wrongness that she'd seen twice in her life before. Both times preceding weather, she did not want to be outside in. "Yes," she said. "Tell Mr. Flint to check the fence lines on the north pasture before dark." Canyon pasture should hold, but the north section, she remembered walking that fence her second week at Iron Creek, noting the post that had heaved with the freeze-thaw cycle and was no longer seated deep enough. The third post from the creek bend needs attention. Pete was already moving toward the door. And Pete, he stopped. "Don't wait to tell him, right now." "Yes, ma'am." He went. She finished packing the order and spent the next 40 minutes moving everything that couldn't get wet into protected storage, doing it methodically and without rushing. Because rushing made you miss things, and she could not afford to miss things right now. Then she went to the house and started the stove high and began preparing a meal that would hold heat for a long time, because she had a feeling it was going to be a long night. Calder came in at 5:30 with snow on his shoulders and a look on his face she'd learned to read. "North fence?" she asked without turning from the stove. "Fixed the post." But the line runs long and there are two sections I don't love. He pulled off his coat and hung it. This gets bad enough. It's going to get bad enough. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. I'll put Roy on the east watch and check the canyon pasture myself before it gets dark. Eat first. She turned around. Sit down and eat something real before you go back out. He started to say something about not having time. 10 minutes, she said. Sit down. He sat down. She put a plate in front of him and sat across from him with her own. They ate without much talking, which had become their way not because they had nothing to say, but because meals at the end of a hard day were for eating, and the talking could happen after. Outside, the wind picked up another degree. I found out when Judge Price is coming through Harding, Calder said around the middle of the meal. She looked up. 22nd of March, he said. I talked to his clerk's office when I was in town yesterday. Price has agreed to an informal review of the documents if we can present them properly organized. 22nd. She calculated. That's 8 days after Crowell's deadline. Yes. She put her fork down. Then we needed to file something before the deadline. Something that creates a legal hold on the deed transfer while the review proceeds. The clerk in Harding said a formal petition of dispute can delay a transfer for 30 days if it's filed with sufficient documentation. What counts as sufficient documentation? The discrepancy in at least 2 sets of contracts. Original and county record, side by side. He met her eyes. You have that. I have that for 5 ranches. Then we file before the deadline. He picked up his fork. I spoke to a lawyer in Harding. Name's Colmderry. He's not from this area. Came up from Colorado last year. He's willing to look at what you've found. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Why are you only telling me this now? I wanted to know Price's timeline before I said anything. I didn't want to give you a plan that had a hole in it. She looked at him across the table. He had done exactly what she would have done, waited until he had the whole picture before presenting it, because incomplete information was more dangerous than no information when decisions were at stake. She picked up her fork. All right, she said. We need those documents organized properly before the end of the week. I'll work with Frank and Beaumont, too. The wind hit the house with enough force that the lamp flame flattened sideways, and both of them looked at the window. Calder stood. I need to get back out, he said. I know. She stood, too. Go check the canyon pasture. I'll watch the north fence from here. He was pulling his coat on before she finished the sentence. The storm became what she'd feared it would become by 7 o'clock. The snow wasn't heavy so much as relentless, not the wet packing snow that was at least predictable in its accumulation, but a dry, wind-driven snow that cut horizontal and found every gap in every structure and made visibility 10 feet beyond the porch an optimistic estimate. Mabel kept the stove hot and the lamps full and worked at the kitchen table organizing the contract documents into the sequence Colmderry had specified, because there was nothing else useful she could do right now and the work needed doing. Roy came in at 7:30, stamping snow off his boots, and told her the east fence was holding. Where's Mr. Flint? She asked. Canyon pasture last I saw. He was checking the far gate when I came back. How long ago? Roy thought about it. Hour, maybe. She looked at the window. An hour in this storm for a round trip to the canyon pasture and back was on the outer edge of reasonable. Kept working. At 8:15, Pete came in from the barn looking frightened. North fence is down, he said. Section near the creek bend. I don't know how many got out. I couldn't see past the fence line. Mabel stood up. How many were in the north pasture? 20, maybe 22. The ones we moved up last week. 20 head of breeding stock in a blizzard with a fence down. She did the math on what that meant for Iron Creek's spring recovery. Where's Roy? Barn. Tell him to stay there. Keep the animals that are still in calm. She was already moving to the door, pulling her coat from the hook. I'm going to find Mr. Flint. Pete stared at her. Miss Mabel, you can't go out and... Which horse is strongest in bad weather? That'd be Duchess, the draft. But saddle her. Miss Mabel, nobody goes out in a storm like this. The hands all said, Pete. She said his name with enough weight that he stopped. She looked at him directly. The north fence is down, and Calder has been in the canyon pasture for over an hour. You understand what that means. Pete's face changed. He went to saddle Duchess. Mabel had grown up in Ohio, in a family that didn't have enough money to be comfortable, but had enough land to require real work. And the real work had built her into something that people who only saw the surface of her consistently misjudged. She was not fast. She had never been fast. But she was strong in the way that mattered in sustained, brutal conditions, deep muscle strong, with the kind of endurance that came from years of hard physical work, and a body that, whatever anyone said about it, was built for labor and could last. She knew how to move in bad weather. You didn't fight the wind, you angled into it and used your weight as an anchor and kept your head down and your eyes on the few feet of ground you could see, and you moved steadily, because steadily was the only speed that worked. She had strapped a canvas pack onto Duchess before she rode out rope, a blanket, a tin of matches in a waterproof pouch, 2 strips of dried beef, a flask of hot coffee she'd poured before leaving the house. She'd done it without thinking, the way you packed for any difficult job, with the assumption that things would take longer and go worse than you expected, and that preparation was the only honest response to that reality. She found the first cattle 30 yards past the broken fence. 3 of them, standing with their backs to the wind in the inadequate shelter of a snow-drifted scrub brush, making the sound cattle made when they were cold and frightened and wanted to go back to where they'd come from. She noted their location. She would need to come back for them and kept going. Canyon pasture was 3/4 of a mile east. In normal conditions, 15 minutes on horseback. Tonight, with Duchess pushing into the wind and the visibility dropping every few minutes, it took closer to 40. She almost rode past him. She would have if Duchess hadn't shied. The horse stopped and angled sideways, and Mabel pulled her up and looked into the white dark around them, and she saw it a shape in the snow that was the wrong shape for a drift. Large and irregular. She got down from Duchess and moved toward it, leading the horse, her boots breaking through a crust of ice with every step. It was Calder's horse first. The animal was down on one side. Breathing, she could see the steam of its breath in the dim light, but not moving. One foreleg at an angle that told her everything she needed to know about whether the horse would be getting up on its own. Calder was underneath the horse's left shoulder. Not pinned completely, the horse hadn't rolled on him, but wedged against a frozen embankment with the horse's weight across his lower legs and the cold working on him fast. She got down on her knees in the snow beside him. Calder. He opened his eyes. They were glassy, but present he was conscious, which was the most important thing. Mabel. His voice was thick, slower than usual. How did you? Don't talk yet. She put her hands on his face. His skin was so cold she could feel it through her gloves. Not frozen, not yet, but close. I need to move the horse. I'm going to use the rope. Stay still. The fence broke. I know. Stay still. She got the rope from Duchess's pack and worked quickly, because quickly was what the situation required, and because standing around thinking about whether this would work was a waste of time she didn't have. She looped the rope under the horse's girth in a way that gave her purchase without tightening around the animal's injury, tied it to Duchess's saddle horn, and then spoke quietly to Duchess while she positioned herself at the downed horse's shoulder. Easy, she told Duchess. Easy now. Pull. Duchess pulled. Mabel pushed. The horse shifted not easily, not smoothly, with the lurching, heavy resistance of a large animal that didn't want to move, but it shifted enough. She grabbed Calder under both arms and pulled. He was a tall man, and he was dead weight from the cold and from the shock of the fall, and she pulled him clear with every bit of strength she had in her back and her legs and the core of her that had been carrying heavy things for 29 years. And she got him 3 feet, 4 feet, clear of the horse. And then she sat down in the snow herself for 5 seconds and breathed. 5 seconds. Then she got up. Can you stand? She asked him. Maybe. He tried, made it to one knee, my legs. Cold, not broken. She put his arm over her shoulder and took his weight and stood them both up. Lean on me. Mabel, you can't. Don't tell me what I can't do right now, she said, without any heat in it. Save it for later. He made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else, and he leaned on her, and she walked them both to Duchess. Getting him onto the horse was harder than anything else. He was 6'2" and barely functional from the cold, and the horse was nervous. And the snow was coming harder now, and she had to use the embankment as a step, positioning him beside it and essentially boosting him from below while he used what arm strength he had left to pull himself up. He made it, barely. She took Duchess's reins and started walking. "You should ride," Calder said from above her. His voice was still thick but clearing. "She's carrying you," Mabel said. "She doesn't need both of us." "Mabel, I walk fine," she said. "I've walked farther." She walked. She walked because there was nothing else to do, and because the alternative was unacceptable, and because her body was built for exactly this kind of sustained, grinding physical effort, whatever anyone had ever said about it. She walked with her head down and her hand on Duchess's lead, and the wind coming at her from the northwest like something personal, and she thought about the contract documents on the kitchen table, and the February payment, and the 22 head of cattle loose in this storm, and everything that still needed doing. Because thinking about those things kept the cold from becoming the only thing there was. They found more cattle on the way back. Not because she was looking at the ground and keeping direction, but because Duchess found them, the way horses found other large animals in bad conditions. 12 head, drifted against a long rise in the terrain, huddled together with the specific miserable patience of animals that had decided the best strategy was to stop moving and wait. She got them moving, not with drama, just by getting around behind them and walking them forward, using the same steady presence she used for everything. They went where she pushed them. Animals, in her experience, responded to steadiness. The way people responded to it, they settled, and they followed. By the time Iron Creek's gate lamp came into view through the snow, she had 12 cattle behind her, Calder on Duchess above her, and approximately 4 miles of hard walking in her legs. Pete came running from the barn when he heard them. He stopped dead when he saw what she'd brought back. Roy appeared behind him in the barn doorway and said absolutely nothing for a long moment. Calder got himself down from Duchess with Pete's help unsteady, wincing when he put weight on his left leg, but down and standing. He looked at Mabel. She was snow-covered from the shoulders down, and her face was red from the cold, and her breathing was harder than she'd let herself show for the last half-mile. Because she'd known they were close, and she wasn't going to let it show when they were that close. "The other 3 are near the north fence break," she said. "And Calder's horse needs the vet foreleg, maybe 2 places." She handed Roy the lead rope. "Get these in," she said. "And someone fix that fence section before morning, or we'll spend all day chasing them again." She walked to the house. She got inside, got the door closed, and stood in the entryway for a moment, with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, and let herself have 30 seconds of being exactly as exhausted as she was. 30 seconds. Then she went to the stove and stoked it up and put water on and went back to the kitchen table where the contract documents were still laid out waiting for her. Calder's left knee had taken the impact when his horse stumbled on the ice, not broken, but badly wrenched. The joint swollen by the time Roy helped him to the house, and Mabel made him sit down and looked at it with the same methodical attention she applied to everything. "I've seen worse," she said. "That's not encouraging." It wasn't meant to be encouraging. It was meant to be accurate. She wrapped it with strips of clean cloth she'd cut, firm and even. "You'll walk. Not comfortably for 2 weeks, but you'll walk." He sat with his leg up on a second chair and watched her work. She was aware of him watching and chose not to address it. "Cattle you brought back," he said. "That's 12 head." "Yes." "In that storm, they were grouping for warmth. They weren't hard to move once I found them." She tied off the wrapping. "Pete will get the other 3 in the morning when the wind drops." "Mabel." She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression that was different from his usual controlled reserve, not the edge of a smile, not the careful assessment she'd learned to read. Something more direct than that. Something that had been stripped of its usual management by cold and pain and the particular honesty that came from having been helpless in a way you hadn't expected. "I know what you walked into out there," he said. "I know what that was." "You needed finding," she said simply. "Other people weren't going." She stood up, straightening her back. "I'm not saying that to make myself sound like something. I'm saying it because it's what happened. United finding, and I went and found you, and I brought back 12 cattle while I was at it." She picked up the cloth scraps. It was a practical problem. He was quiet. "You could have died," he said. So could you? She set the cloth on the table. Did. That stopped him. She hadn't meant it to come out exactly that way with that particular weight. But it had, and it was true, and she wasn't going to take it back. Calder held her gaze for a long moment. Sit down, he said quietly. You've been on your feet for 6 hours. I have things too. Mabel. His voice was gentle and absolutely firm. Sit down. She sat down. He poured her coffee from the pot she'd left on the stove, had to do it slowly because his knee wouldn't let him move fast, and set it in front of her without ceremony, and then sat back in his own chair. She wrapped her hands around the cup. The storm was still going outside. The lamp flickered twice in a draft from somewhere and then steadied. Tell me something, Calder said. She looked at him. When you walked out there tonight, with the rope and the blanket, and he paused. Scared? She thought about it honestly. Yes. Of what? She looked at the coffee cup. Not finding you in time. Kitchen was very quiet. Not of the storm, he said. Storm was just weather, she said. Weather I could work with. The other thing, she stopped. He didn't press her. He never pressed her. After a moment, she said, I've been on my own a long time, Calder. Since I was about 22, and in that time I've learned how to be fine when things don't work out. How to pack your bag and move to the next town and start again. She held the cup. But tonight I realized I hadn't thought about what it would mean if she stopped again. If this particular thing didn't work out, she looked up at him. He was watching her with that direct, stripped-back expression. This particular thing, he said. Iron Creek, she said. Pause, he held her gaze. Right, he said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The documents, she said finally. I need to get them to Colm Dairy by Friday, which means I need to ride to Harding Thursday morning at the latest. I'll go with you. I'll manage. His voice was final without being harsh. I'm not sending you to Harding alone with those documents. She looked at him. Because of Crowell? Because of Crowell. He paused. And because I'd like to be there. She picked up her coffee. All right. The storm cleared by Wednesday morning, leaving Iron Creek under 14 inches of snow, a sky that was blue and indifferent, the way Wyoming sky was after it had done something terrible, bright and clean, as though it had nothing to do with any of it. Pete found the 3 remaining cattle within an hour of first light. They were cold and unhappy, but alive, and he got them back through the repaired fence section with Roy's help. While Mabel made breakfast and Calder sat at the kitchen table with his leg elevated and worked through the account book, which was the one job she'd let him do without argument. Word traveled to Cedar Mercy the way word always traveled. By Thursday, when Mabel and Calder rode into Harding to meet with Colm Dairy, 3 separate people in Cedar Mercy had told the story of Mabel Winslow walking back through an Iron Creek gate in a blizzard with 12 head of cattle and Calder Flint across her horse. The red kerchief cowboy heard it in the copper kettle and said nothing. Dorothy Vance heard it and said, with something that might have been satisfaction, I told you she wasn't what people thought. Thaddeus Crowell heard it from one of his men and was quiet for longer than usual before he said, It doesn't change anything. But he said it once, and with a flatness that told the man who'd delivered the news that it was not a subject to revisit. Colm Dairy had an office on the 2nd floor of a building in Harding that smelled like wood polish and paper. He was 34 years old, originally from Denver, with a methodical quality that Mabel recognized immediately as someone who had also learned that thoroughness was the only honest approach to complicated problems. He looked at the documents for a long time. He asked her to walk him through her analysis twice. He asked specific questions about methodology, about how she'd accessed the county records, about the chain of custody for the original contracts she'd obtained from the ranching families. She answered everything directly. When she didn't know something, she said so. Calder sat in the corner of the room and said almost nothing, which was correct. This was her work, and he understood that. When she finished, Dairy sat back in his chair and looked at the documents spread across his desk. You understand what you're alleging, he said. I'm not alleging anything, Mabel said. I'm presenting discrepancies in the documentary record and asking you to determine what they mean legally. Dairy looked at her. That's a careful way to put it, he said. The accurate way. She folded her hands. If the discrepancies have an innocent explanation, I want to know it. If they don't, I want to know that too. He was quiet for a moment. Petition of dispute, he said. If I file it before the 14th. The deed transfer is delayed 30 days, Mabel said. Which puts us past Price's review date. Yes. He tapped the documents. I can file it. I'll need the original contracts, the ones from the ranching families, as supporting exhibits. I have them. I'll send them with Pete tomorrow morning. Derry looked at Calder. You understand that filing this will make Crowell aware that you're disputing the note. He already thinks he's won, Calder said. Let him keep thinking that until the filing is made. Derry nodded slowly. He looked at Mabel one more time. How did you know where to look, he asked. In the contracts. She thought about it. I've kept accounts for a long time, she said. And I've learned that when numbers tell you one story and paper tells you another story, somebody is lying. You just have to decide which one. Derry wrote something in his notebook. I'll have the petition ready by Monday, he said. They rode back to Iron Creek in the late afternoon, the snow bright and the shadows long, the temperature dropping now that the storm had passed and left nothing to hold the cold at bay. Calder's knee was hurting him. She could tell from the way he sat the horse, compensating without realizing he was doing it. She didn't mention it. Halfway back, he said, You handled that well. He's good, she said. He'll do it right. I meant you. The way you presented it. He rode for a moment. You've done that before. Explain something complicated to someone who needed to be convinced without feeling like they were being told what to think. She considered that. I've had practice explaining myself to people who started by not taking me seriously. He was quiet. He started. I'm not criticizing you, she said. Or anyone specific. It's just been the shape of most of my life. You learn to be clear and calm and organized, because if you're any of those things slightly less than completely, you give people the excuse they're looking for. He absorbed that. How long have you been doing that? He said. Since I was about 14, she said. When I was big enough that people started reacting to what I looked like before they heard a word I said. She kept her eyes on the road. You learn to compensate. You learn to be twice as prepared and half as emotional and 3 times as organized. Gets to be a habit. The horses moved through the snow for a moment. Must be exhausting, Calder said. She thought about that. You get used to it. That's not the same as it not being exhausting. She looked at him sideways. He was watching the road ahead, his profile steady in the cold late light, and he said it the way he said most things without performance, without the inflection that would have made it a point he was making about himself or about anything other than exactly what he'd said. She looked back at the road. No, she said after a moment. It isn't. They rode the rest of the way back in the easy silence that had become theirs over the weeks, and the ranch gate came up through the blue dusk, and Pete had the lamp lit at the post. And the smoke from the kitchen stove was visible above the roofline, and something in Mabel's chest did a thing she recognized and chose, for now, not to examine. There was still the petition to get filed, still the documents to organize, still the morning provision run, and the accounts, and the breeding stock to check after the storm. There was always still something. She got down from her horse and handed the reins to Pete and walked toward the house with the cold at her back and the lamplight ahead, and she thought, this is what it feels like to have something worth protecting. She went inside. She hung up her coat. She went to the kitchen and stoked the stove and began, because there was nothing else to do and everything else to do, to make supper. Colm Derry filed the petition of dispute on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon Thaddeus Crowell knew about it. That was the thing about small counties, and information moved faster than horses, faster than weather, faster than anything except the particular velocity of news that someone powerful didn't want traveling. Crowell had ears in the clerk's office, ears in the courthouse hallway, ears in the hotel dining room where lawyers ate lunch. He had cultivated those ears over 5 years with the same patient methodology he applied to everything else, and they worked exactly as designed. By Monday evening, one of his men had ridden to Iron Creek. Mabel was in the smokehouse when she heard the horse. She came to the door and looked out and saw a man she recognized broad through the chest. One of the two who had stood behind Crowell during his visit, tying up at the fence, with the particular unhurried manner of someone who had been told to deliver a message and was taking his time about it to make a point. She walked out to meet him before he reached the porch, because she preferred to have conversations in the open air where she could see everything around her. "Mr. Flint isn't available," she said. The man looked at her. "I'll wait. You'll deliver your message to me or you'll leave," she said. Those are the options. He assessed her for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether the situation required him to be unpleasant. He apparently decided it didn't. "Mr. Crowell wants Mr. Flint to know that the petition doesn't change anything. The note is valid and the deadline stands." "Mr. Flint is aware of the deadline," Mabel said. "Is there anything else?" The man looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite a threat, more like the shadow of one, cast at a distance. "Mr. Crowell also wants Mr. Flint to know that involving outside lawyers in a private business matter tends to complicate things for everyone involved." He paused. "Everyone." Mabel held his gaze without moving. "Tell Mr. Crowell," she said, "that Mr. Flint appreciates the message." The man untied his horse and rode out. She stood at the fence and watched him until he was gone, and then she went back to the smokehouse and finished what she'd been doing, because there was nothing else useful she could do with what had just happened, except think about it carefully while her hands kept working. Crowell was rattled. Not badly. Not yet. But a rattled man behaved differently from a confident one, and differently was something she could work with. Calder had gone to Cedar Mercy that afternoon for supplies, and came back to find Pete waiting at the gate with the news about Crowell's man. He came to the kitchen looking for Mabel, and she told him what had been said, and then she told him what she thought it meant. "He's not actually certain the petition will fail," she said. "If he were, he wouldn't have sent anyone." Calder sat down slowly, favoring his knee. "He's trying to scare us off before Derry gets the documents in front of Price." "Yes. Which means he knows the documents are a problem." She set coffee in front of him. "He's had access to those county records. He knows what's in them. If the discrepancies were something he could explain away, he wouldn't be worried." "Can Derry protect himself?" Calder asked. "If Crowell decides to apply pressure there?" "Derry's from Colorado. He doesn't have anything in this county that Crowell can use against him." She sat down across from him. "That's why I chose him." Calder looked at his coffee. "How long have you been thinking about all of this?" he said. "Since the night I sat up with your contracts." She folded her hands on the table. "I couldn't be certain the discrepancies were what I thought they were. But I knew that if they were, we'd need a lawyer with no local exposure and a judge with no local obligation. So I started looking for both. While you were running the provision business and managing the ranch accounts and fixing the smokehouse shelf." The shelf took 20 minutes. She paused. "Things have to happen at the same time. That's how real situations work." He looked at her with that expression she'd stopped being able to categorize. It wasn't the controlled smile thing, and it wasn't the careful assessment. It was something she didn't have a name for yet. "What happens if the petition doesn't hold?" he said. "Crowell moves on the deed before Price gets here?" She'd thought about this too. "Then we have the documents, and we have Derry, and we have Price's review, regardless of whether the property is technically in Crowell's name at that point. A fraudulent transfer can be reversed." She paused. "It's harder, but it's not impossible. That's not a comforting plan B." "No," she said, "it isn't." He drank his coffee. "Frank came by the feed store today," he said after a moment. "He's been talking to the other families, the Beaumonts, Stills, 2 others. They're all willing to testify if Price opens a formal inquiry." Straightened slightly. "All of them?" Frank said Old Man Beaumont told his wife last night that he didn't sleep better until he decided to fight back. Calder set his cup down. She apparently told him he should have decided that 18 months ago. Mabel looked at the table for a moment. "She's not wrong," she said. "But he's deciding now. That's what matters." The week between filing the petition and Job Price's arrival was the longest week Mabel could remember in recent years, and she had had some long ones. She filled the time the way she always filled difficult waiting with work. The provision business needed managing. The accounts needed closing for February. The breeding stock needed monitoring now that the storm had stressed them, and 2 of the cows needed closer attention than Roy could give them alone. She woke before 5 every morning and was in the kitchen or the barn or the smokehouse until after dark, and she slept hard when she finally stopped and the days moved. She was aware of the deadline every morning when she woke up. Crowell's 30 days were counting down like something physical, a weight that got incrementally heavier regardless of what else she was carrying. On the Thursday of that week, Calder found her at the kitchen table at midnight going through the contract documents one more time. He stood in the doorway in his work clothes. He'd been up with one of the stressed cows. She knew and looked at her. "You've been through those 4 times," he said. "5, she said. "I want to make sure I haven't missed anything." He came in and sat down across from her without being asked, which was something that had gradually happened over the weeks. The way the space between them had changed, from the careful courtesy of employer and employee to something with less formality and more weight to it. "What would you have missed?" he said. "I don't know. That's why I keep looking." She turned a page. Crowell had a system. Systems have patterns. If there's a pattern I haven't found yet, Price will find it for us, but I'd rather find it myself so we can present it, not just hope someone else catches it. "You don't trust other people to do their jobs." "I trust Derry," she said. "I trust Price based on what you've told me." She paused. "I trust very few people to do things correctly without verification." "That sounds lonely," Calder said. She looked up at him. He wasn't saying it to be pointed. He said it the way he said things plainly, with no particular destination in mind. "I've gotten used to it," she said. "You said that before." "About the compensating." He rested his forearms on the table. "Getting used to something isn't the same as it's being how things should be." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know that," she said quietly. "I just want to—" He stopped, seemed to be choosing words, which was unusual for him, because he was generally economical about language and didn't usually need to search for it. "I want to make sure you know that this is not that. Here." He gestured not elaborately, just a slight movement of his hand indicating the kitchen, the ranch, the space between them. "You don't have to verify everything 3 times here. Roy and Pete are good. Derry is good." He stopped again. "You what?" she said. He looked at her directly. "I am not going to let you do this alone, and then take the result and thank you for it. That's not what this is." She set the document down. Something in her chest did the thing she'd been studiously not examining for several weeks. It did it clearly and without any ambiguity, and she sat with it for a moment, looking at the table. "Calder," she said. "Yeah, close the accounts book. It's midnight." He reached across the table and closed it. "Go to sleep," she said. "You first." She looked at him. He looked at her. He had the expression she didn't have a name for, yet steady and direct and containing something she wasn't ready to address at midnight in a kitchen, while a deadline counted down and the breeding stock needed monitoring. "Fine," she said. She put the documents in their folder and went to her room. She did not sleep immediately, but she stopped going through the documents. Judge Harlan Price arrived in Harding on the 22nd of March on the afternoon stage, which was delayed by road conditions, and arrived at 4:15 instead of 2 o'clock, which meant the preliminary meeting with Derry couldn't happen until the following morning. Mabel spent the night at Harding's hotel, in a room that was clean and narrow and cold, from a window that didn't seat properly in its frame. She lay on the bed with her coat over the blankets and went through the documents in her head one more time. Not because she'd missed anything, but because the repetition had become its own kind of discipline, way of holding the structure of the argument in her mind until it was as solid as she could make it. Calder was in the room next door. She knew because she could hear him moving around for a while and then going quiet, and there was something about knowing that he was 12 feet away through a wall that was both ordinary and, if she let herself think about it, not ordinary at all. She didn't let herself think about it. She went to sleep. Price was not what she'd expected. She'd expected someone austere, the way judges in her experience tended toward austerity, the gravity of the position, settling into the face until the face became the position. Price was 61, stout, with reading glasses he took on and off during the conversation, and a habit of saying at the end of other people's sentences that could mean agreement or skepticism, or simply that he was still listening. He listened to Derry's presentation first. Then he looked at the documents. Then he asked Mabel to explain her methodology. She explained it clearly, and without ornamentation, the way she'd learned to explain things. She showed him the discrepancies in Sequence Iron Creek's contracts first. since she knew them best, then the Beaumont records, then the three others, each one laid beside its county record equivalent with the numbers annotated in her careful handwriting. Price took his glasses off. He put them back on. He looked at the documents for a long time. "These are consistent," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," Mabel said. "Pattern is identical across all 5 properties. The same fields, the same type of discrepancy, always in the same direction." "When did you first notice the discrepancy in the Iron Creek contracts?" 6 weeks ago. "And you've been collecting the others since then?" "Yes." Price looked at Derry. "Who else has seen these?" "Myself, the 5 property families, and a county records clerk who helped with access, but doesn't know the purpose of the review," Derry said. "Crowell? He knows we've filed the petition. He doesn't know the scope of what we have." Price put his glasses on the table and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I want to be precise about something," he said. "I'm looking at evidence of discrepancy between original contract terms and the county record copies. The cause of that discrepancy could theoretically be clerical error." "Yes," Mabel said, "it could, but you don't believe it is." "The same clerical error, in the same direction, producing the same type of inflation, across 5 separate properties over a span of 3 years." She folded her hands. "I've kept accounts for 15 years. Clerical errors cluster randomly. They don't repeat systematically." Price looked at her. "What's your background, Miss Winslow?" "I kept accounts for a dry goods merchant in Cheyenne for 14 months. Before that, a shipping firm in Ohio for 3 years. Before that, a mill office for 2 years. You have no legal training." "No. And yet you identified something that 3 lawyers, based on what Mr. Alderman has told Mr. Derry, missed." She was quiet for a moment. "The lawyers were looking at whether the contracts were legally valid on their face," she said. "I was looking at whether the numbers matched. Those are different questions." Price was quiet. He picked up his glasses. He put them on. "I'm going to open a formal inquiry," he said. "I want the county records clerk in this office tomorrow morning. I want Gerald Petch from Cedar Mercy's bank by end of week." He looked at Derry. "The deed transfer on Iron Creek is stayed pending inquiry. File that today." Derry wrote something. Price looked at Mabel. "You understand that an inquiry takes time," he said, "and that Crowell will have legal representation and the opportunity to offer alternative explanations." "I understand that," she said, "and if those explanations are sufficient." "Then they're sufficient," she said. "I'm not asking you to find him guilty of anything. I'm asking you to look at the numbers and determine whether they're accurate. That's all I've ever been asking." Price studied her for a moment with the assessment of a man who had spent 40 years in courtrooms and had learned to read people the way she'd learned to read account books. "All right," he said. He stood. The meeting was over. In the hallway outside, Calder was waiting on a bench. He stood when they came out, reading their faces. Mabel said, "He's opening a formal inquiry. The deed transfer is stayed." Calder breathed out slowly. Derry shook both their hands and said he'd be in touch, and walked back toward Price's office with his briefcase. And they were left in the hallway of the Harding courthouse, in the middle of a March morning, with the particular feeling of a thing that had been set in motion that couldn't be stopped now. "What happens now?" Calder said. "Now we wait," she said. "And we go home and we keep working, because the herd still needs." "Mabel." He said her name with that weight again. She looked at him. "It worked," he said. "It's working," she said. "It's not done." "No, but it's working." He looked at her, that direct, stripped-back expression that appeared when he wasn't managing himself carefully. "Because of you." She looked at the floor for a second. "Because of the documents," she said. "I just read them." "You walked 30 miles to get to this county," he said. "You walked into a cafe and got laughed at and you kept going. You kept accounts nobody asked you to keep, and you found something nobody else was looking for, and you built a case out of it and presented it to a judge this morning without a single mistake." He paused. "That's not the documents. That's you." She stood in the courthouse hallway and let that sit for a moment. It was a strange thing, she'd learned, to have someone describe you accurately. Most people described you inaccurately, either better than you were, which was its own kind of pressure, or worse, which was its own kind of damage. Accuracy was harder to receive than either of those. All right, she said finally. All right, he said. They walked out of the courthouse and into the March morning, which was cold but had a different quality of cold than February, less punishment in it, more the memory of warmth, returning somewhere underneath. Gerald Petch came before Price on Friday. Mabel wasn't in the room, she had no standing to be there, and Derry had advised against it. She and Calder waited in the hotel dining room across the street and drank coffee and said almost nothing for 2 hours. When Derry came across the street at 11:30, his face told them something before he sat down. Petch talked, he said. Calder set his cup down carefully. Derry sat across from them. He's been cooperative with the bank's recording process for 5 years. He didn't alter the documents himself. That was done by someone with access to the county clerk's records office, someone Crowell paid directly. But Petch knew the called notes were based on inflated figures. He signed the transfer paperwork anyway. Why? Mabel said. Derry looked at his hands. Crowell had documentation of Petch mishandling funds from another account. Small amounts over several years. Nothing criminal, but enough to end his career and his reputation. He paused. Crowell was very careful about that kind of thing. He had something on Petch. He had something on the records clerk. He built his operation on mutual exposure. The dining room was quiet around them. Mabel thought about the ranching families, about Beaumont's wife, about Frank Alderman working day labor at the stockyards. Is it enough? Calder said. What Petch told them. Price thinks so. He's issuing a formal finding of fraud by end of next week. The deed transfers on all 5 properties are stayed pending reversal hearings. Derry looked at them both. Iron Creek stays yours. Calder was still for a moment. Then he said, and the other families? Reversal hearings will take time. But with Petch's testimony and the documentary record, Derry thinks most of them will get their property back. He paused. Not all of it, necessarily. There have been improvements made, transactions involved. It'll be complicated. But possible, Mabel said. Possible, Derry confirmed. She sat with that. Possible was not certain. Possible was not justice, in the clean, complete sense that Beaumont's wife deserved. But possible was more than these families had had 6 weeks ago, when they'd been sitting in rented houses and working day labor, and telling themselves there was nothing to be done. What about Crowell? Calder said. That's for the county prosecutor now, Derry said. Price has referred the matter. Whether charges are brought depends on what the prosecutor decides. He paused. Crowell's lawyer is already in town. Of course he is, Mabel said. He'll fight the reversal hearings. He'll argue the record's discrepancy is clerical. He'll argue Petch is an unreliable witness motivated by self-protection. Derry looked at Mabel. He's going to attack your analysis specifically. He'll argue you have no legal or professional credentials to make the determination you made. She had expected this. My credentials are the documents themselves, she said. Either the numbers match or they don't. I didn't determine anything. I observed a discrepancy and reported it. Anyone with basic arithmetic can verify what I found. Derry almost smiled. That's exactly what I'll argue. Verbatim, if you don't mind. I don't mind. He stood, gathered his papers. I'll send word when the formal finding is issued. In the meantime, he looked at them both. Go home. Keep working. Don't speak to Crowell or anyone connected to him without me present. Understood, Calder said. Derry left. They sat in the dining room for a moment. Frank should know, Calder said. I'll write to him today, Mabel said. And the Beaumonts. I'll tell Roy and Pete. She nodded. Picked up her coffee cup and found it was empty, had been for a while. She set it back down. Calder. He looked at her. When this is over, she said carefully. When the hearings are done and Crowell's finished in this valley. She paused. What happens to the provision business? He was quiet for a moment. That depends, he said. On what? He looked at her with that direct expression. On what you want. She looked at the empty coffee cup. She had asked the question because she needed to understand what she was planning for. Because she had gotten in the habit of planning, and the plan required knowing whether she was planning for one future or another.
Whether Iron Creek was a place she was working through a difficult season or a place she was the
Word was the problem. The word caught somewhere between what was accurate and what she'd allowed herself to expect. I want the provision business to keep running, she said, and the accounts managed properly, and the breeding stock handled the way I've been handling it. That's what I want too, Calder said. That's not an answer to my question. He looked at her steadily. I know. She looked at him. He said, what I want is for you to stay, not because the ranch needs you, though it does. Because he stopped, started again. I'm not good at saying things like this. I've been alone on that ranch for 3 years, and I got used to not having to say things like this. Like what? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Like the fact that I haven't felt like Iron Creek was actually a home since my father died, he said. And then you arrived and reorganized the storeroom and told me my cattle management was wrong and stayed up all night with contracts and walked into a blizzard after me and made it, he stopped. Made it feel like it was supposed to feel. She sat very still. That's a lot to put on a woman who reorganized your storeroom, she said. He almost smiled. Yeah, Calder, yeah, she looked at the table. She looked at her hands cracked and work-worn, the hands of someone who had been working hard things for a long time. I haven't let myself want something specific in a long time, she said. A specific place. A specific she stopped, I know, he said. I don't know how to do that without being careful about it. I'm not asking you to stop being careful, he said. I'm just asking you to think about it. She looked up at him. He was watching her with more patience than she'd ever had anyone watch her, with not waiting for a particular answer, not performing the waiting. Just actually waiting. All right, she said. All right, he said. They sat in the hotel dining room in Harding, Wyoming on a cold March morning, and outside the window the street was ordinary and muddy, and the stage had arrived, and someone was arguing with the driver about a trunk. And nothing about the moment was dramatic or resolved, and both of them knew there was still a long way to go. But it was something. It was the beginning of something, which was more than either of them had walked into Cedar Mercy expecting. Back in the bitter winter, when one woman had been laughed at for walking through a door, and one man had pushed his last bowl of stew across a table and put on his hat. She paid for the coffee. He held the door. They walked out into the March morning together, and neither of them said anything else about it, because neither of them needed to. Not yet. Price's formal finding came on a Wednesday 8 days after the preliminary meeting, delivered by courier to Colm Derry's office in Harding, and forwarded by rider to Iron Creek before noon. Mabel was in the barn checking on the 2 cows that had been stressed by the blizzard when Pete came running across the yard with a folded paper in his hand, and his face doing something complicated between excitement and the uncertainty. Of someone who didn't want to say the wrong thing. She took the paper and read it, standing in the barn doorway, with the morning light coming in flat and cold behind her. The language was formal, the way legal language always was dense, with qualifications and procedural references that turned a simple fact into a paragraph. But the simple fact was there, underneath all of it. Judge Harlan Price had found sufficient evidence of systematic fraud in the property records of Cedar Mercy County. The deed transfers on all 5 properties were formally stayed pending reversal hearings. Gerald Petch had been suspended from his position, pending a separate inquiry. The county records clerk, a man named Voss, whose name Mabel had not known until this moment, had been taken into custody 2 days earlier. And Thaddeus Crowell had been served notice of criminal fraud charges that morning in his own house by a county deputy who had driven out from Harding before breakfast. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket and went back to checking on the cows, and the cows still needed checking. Pete stood in the doorway watching her. Well, he said. Go tell Roy, she said, and then come back and help me with this feed. Miss Mabel's Pete. He went to tell Roy. She crouched beside the nearer cow and ran her hand along the animal's flank and felt the tension in the muscle that had been there since the blizzard, slowly, gradually releasing over the past 3 weeks. The cow turned her head and looked at Mabel with the large and curious patience that cows had, which Mabel had always found oddly steadying. All right, she said to the cow or to herself or to the barn in general. All right. She heard Calder's horse come through the gate 20 minutes later. He'd been in Cedar Mercy since early morning. She hadn't told him the courier was expected today, because she hadn't wanted to build it up in case it went wrong. She heard him dismount and speak to Pete, and she could hear from across the yard the shift in Pete's voice when he told him. Calder came to the barn. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she straightened up and looked back at him. "Price found for us," she said. He said nothing for a moment. "All 5 properties," he said. "All 5. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and for a moment his face did something she had never seen it do, not the controlled expression, not the contained reserve. Something underneath all of that, unmanaged and honest, the face of a man who had been holding something very tightly for a very long time and had just been given permission to put it down. He looked away, out across the yard, back at her. "The Beaumonts," he said. "I need to tell Frank. I'll write the letters," she said. "You ride," he nodded. He started to turn, then stopped. "Mabel, go tell them," she said. "That's more important than anything you're about to say." He put his hat on and went. She went to the house and wrote 4 letters. The reversal hearings took 3 months. Not all at once they were staggered, because Crowell's lawyer was thorough, in the way that expensive lawyers were thorough, filing challenges and requesting continuances and finding procedural angles that delayed each individual hearing by 2 or 3 weeks. It was exhausting in a sustained, grinding way that was harder than the dramatic difficulty of the blizzard, or the petition, or the meeting with Price, because it required endurance of a different kind, the patience to wait, while someone else tried methodically to undo what you'd built. Mabel went to every hearing that Derry permitted her to attend. She sat in the back of the Harding courtroom in her best dress, which was not remarkable, but was clean and pressed and entirely hers, and she listened, and she took notes in her small notebook. And when Crowell's lawyer argued that the discrepancies in the county records were clerical in nature, and that no lay person without legal credentials had standing to characterize them as evidence of fraud, she wrote down exactly what he said and the specific language he used and gave it to Derry afterward. Derry used it. He used it the way she'd told him to by presenting the arithmetic itself, clearly and without interpretation, and asking the court to observe what the arithmetic showed, which was not her opinion, but a simple fact that any person in the room could verify by adding 2 numbers together. Crowell's lawyer was good, but he was arguing against arithmetic, and arithmetic does not negotiate. The Beaumont reversal came through in May. Mabel was at Iron Creek when the word came, and she read the letter from Derry and then sat at the kitchen table for a long moment before she folded it and put it with the others. Old man Beaumont got his land back, the land his wife had been born on. The land that had been taken from him by a man who had used patience and paperwork as weapons because he was too cowardly to take anything directly. She sat with that for a while. She thought about the nature of what had been done to these families, not just the property, but the years of believing there was nothing to be done. Particular cruelty of being defrauded by something you couldn't see clearly enough to fight. She thought about Frank Alderman working day labor at the stockyards while his wife took in washing, and about how that had happened, not because they were weak or careless, but because someone had carefully constructed a situation in which their weakness was manufactured and their loss appeared inevitable. The thing that made her jaw tight, that had always made her jaw tight, when she let herself feel it fully, was not the crime itself, though the crime was serious. It was the assumption behind the crime. The assumption that certain people could be taken from, that certain people could be because they would not be believed when they said they had been robbed. Because no one would look carefully at the numbers on their behalf. Because the people who could have helped had calculated that helping wasn't worth the trouble. She had been counted on not to look carefully. She had been looked through in Crowell's office, in the Copper Kettle, in every room in Cedar Mercy where someone had decided she was not worth accounting for. She thought about what it meant that the counting through had been the mistake, that the thing they'd dismissed her for, the persistence, the attention to detail, the habit of double-checking everything because she'd learned she couldn't rely on anyone else, catching errors on her behalf, was precisely the thing that had undone Crowell's careful, patient. She wasn't sure what to do with that, exactly. It didn't feel like triumph, which was what she'd expected to feel. It felt like something quieter and more complicated, like the recognition of a long, difficult thing finally ending, which was not the same as it never having happened. The Alderman reversal came in June. The Stills family and the 2 remaining ranches came through in July, 2 weeks apart. By the end of July, Thaddeus Crowell had been formally charged with 5 counts of fraudulent property acquisition, Gerald Petch had agreed to testify for the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges, and the man named Voss, who had altered the county records, had already pled guilty in a separate proceeding. Crowell's operation, the patient, methodical machinery he had built over 5 years, was being dismantled in the same courthouse where it had been constructed, piece by careful piece. He did not go quietly. His lawyer filed motions through August. There were delays and counter-arguments, procedural challenges that Derry tracked, and Mabel read about in the letters that arrived twice a week from Harding. But the direction of it was clear, had been clear since Price's formal finding, and a direction that was clear does not stop being clear because someone argues against it loudly. Calder told her one evening in August that 3 separate ranchers who had been afraid of Crowell for years had come up to him at the Cedar Mercy stockyards and shaken his hand. Men who had watched what Crowell did to the valley and said nothing, because saying something had seemed too dangerous or too futile. "What did you tell them?" Mabel asked. They were at the kitchen table, the summer evening light coming through the window, long and golden the way summer evenings in Wyoming were when they bothered to be beautiful. "I told them they should have said something sooner," Calder said. She looked at him. "That's blunt," she said. "It's true." He paused. "I also told them that they had time to do the right thing now, and that what mattered was whether they used it." She looked at the table. "That's more generous than I would have been," she said. "No," he said. "It's just practical. Being angry at them doesn't help the Beaumonts." She thought about that for a moment. It was one of the things she'd learned about Calder over the months that his plainness was not coldness. He saw things clearly and said them plainly, but the framework he was working from was not indifference. He was a man who had been alone for 3 years on a ranch, holding something together through sheer stubbornness, and he hadn't become hard from it. She wasn't entirely sure how, but he hadn't. She was still thinking about that when he said, "I talked to a lawyer about partnership." She looked up. "Not Derry," he said, "someone in Cedar Mercy. A formal business partnership for the provision operation." He kept his eyes on the table. "It would need to be in your name as well as mine. Legal documentation, equal standing." She was very still. "You don't have to." She started. "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's the point of doing it." She looked at him. "Equal standing," she said. "You built it," he said. "It's yours as much as mine. More, maybe. I just want the paper to say what's actually true." She sat with that. She thought about the dry goods merchant in Cheyenne who had let his wife dismiss her over a reorganized shelf. She thought about the merchant before that, and the mill office before that, and the years of doing work that was hers, and watching it belong to other people by default because she had no paper and no standing, and no one who would have argued otherwise. "All right," she said. Her voice was level. "I want to look at the documents before I sign." He almost smiled. "I'd be worried if you didn't." She pushed back from the table. "I'll put supper on, Mabel." She stopped. He looked at her, that direct, stripped-back expression that she'd spent months finding names for, and had finally stopped trying to categorize, because it was simply the expression of a person who was looking at her without any overlay of what they thought she should be, or what use she was, or what she represented to them. He was just looking at her. "I meant what I said in Harding," he said. "In March." She held the back of her chair. "I know," she said. "I haven't said it again, because I didn't want to." "I know," she said again. He was quiet. "I'm not good at this part," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not good at—" She stopped. "Letting something be what it is, without checking it 3 times. "I know that too," he said. "It's not about you," she said. "It's about a long time of being wrong about things I thought were safe. I understand." She looked at him across the kitchen, the evening light between them, the stove behind her, and the account books on the shelf in the window where she'd stood on 100 mornings, watching the yard come alive. "I think I want to stay," she said. "I've been thinking about it since March. I haven't said it because I don't know, because saying it makes it real. And real things can go wrong." "They can," he said. "Doesn't bother you?" "It bothers me," he said. "I just think the alternative is worse." She looked at him. He said, "Spending the rest of my life being careful about something that could have been real seems like a worse outcome than trying and being wrong." Thought about that for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm not going to stop checking the accounts 3 times. I know. Or reorganizing things when they're in the wrong place. Wouldn't expect you to. And I'm going to keep the provision business running the way I've been running it. My decisions. Equal standing," he said. "That's what the paper will say." She let go of the chair. "Supper first," she said. "Then we can talk." "All right." She went to the stove. He sat at the table and opened the account book because there were numbers that needed looking at, and he looked at them, and she made supper, and the evening light moved across the kitchen floor the way it did every evening. And neither of them said anything else for a while, because they didn't need to. They married in October in the Cedar Mercy courthouse, with Derry as a witness, and Frank Alderman, and his wife and Roy and Pete, standing in the small room that smelled like wood polish and old paper. There was no ceremony beyond the legal. Mabel had not wanted ceremony, not because she didn't value the occasion, but because ceremony felt like performance, and she had spent enough of her life performing adequacy for audiences who hadn't asked for it. This was a document, a legal fact, a piece of paper that said what was actually true, which was what she had always wanted, the paper to match the reality. Calder signed his name with the same plain steadiness he applied to everything. She signed hers beside his. Frank Alderman shook both their hands, and his wife, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Clara, who had said approximately 4 sentences total during the proceedings, and each one had been precise, told Mabel that she was glad someone had finally looked at those numbers. "Someone should have looked sooner," Mabel said. "Yes," Clara Alderman said simply. "But you looked. That's what counts." Roy and Pete had apparently coordinated on a gift without telling either of them, a cast iron skillet that Roy had found somewhere, enormous and heavy, the kind that would outlast everyone in the room by several generations. Pete explained, slightly red in the face, that they'd thought it was practical. "It's exactly right," Mabel told him. She meant it. By the following spring, Iron Creek was different. Not unrecognizably, so the fences were in the same places. The barn was the same barn. The house was the same house with its plain rooms and its single lamp above the kitchen table. But the quality of the place had changed in the way that places change when they stop being fought over and start being built. The provision business had grown through the winter into something more structured, a standing contract with 3 droving outfits for spring trail provisions, a weekly order from the general store in Cedar Mercy for preserved goods, and a new arrangement with 2 neighboring ranches to supply their seasonal workers' meals during Roundup. Mabel had hired a woman from town named Estelle to help with the packing and shipping, which freed Mabel to focus on the production and the accounts, which was where her particular skill lay. The breeding stock had come through the winter cleanly. Calder had made decisions she'd recommended without the friction that had characterized the early months, not because he'd become deferential, but because they'd developed the shorthand of 2 people who had worked alongside each other long enough to trust each other's judgment. He still argued with her sometimes. She argued back. Neither of them was good at losing arguments, which meant their disagreements had the particular quality of 2 people, each trying to be correct rather than trying to win, which was different and more productive. Roy had announced in February that he was considering retiring to a cousin's place in Nebraska, and Mabel had said he should absolutely do that if he wanted to, and he'd said he'd think about it. And 3 months later, he was still at Iron Creek, thinking about it. Pete had turned 20 and was building something with a girl from Cedar Mercy in the very early, cautious way that 20-year-olds built things. And Mabel let him take Saturday afternoons when the work allowed, which it increasingly did. Life at Iron Creek was not perfect. The second year's spring was wet, which was good for the grass and bad for the smokehouse, and they lost 2 weeks of production to moisture damage that cost them one of the general store contracts before they could fix the ventilation problem. The cast iron skillet Pete and Roy had given them cracked along the bottom in March cast iron. It turned out was not immortal, and Mabel used it for a storage pan instead, because a cracked thing still had uses. Calder's knee ached in cold weather. He didn't complain about it, but she'd learned to tell, and she kept liniment on the shelf without making a production of it. Thaddeus Crowell's trial concluded in April of the following year. He was convicted on 3 of the 5 fraud counts. The other 2 couldn't be proven to the required standard without Voss. whose testimony had become less reliable after his own sentencing and was sentenced to 4 years in the territorial prison and a substantial fine that effectively ended his business operations in the valley. It was not the complete accounting that the 5 families deserved. Frank Alderman said as much, sitting in Mabel's kitchen the evening after the verdict, drinking coffee and staring at the table with the expression of a man who had hoped for more and was working on accepting what was. 3 counts, he said. 3 counts that resulted in a conviction, Mabel said. He's gone, Frank. Whatever he got sentenced to, he's gone. I know. He turned the cup in his hands. I just keep thinking about the years. My wife's hands. The fence posts she put in. He looked up. You can give me the land back. You can't give me back the years. Mabel sat across from him and said nothing for a moment. Because he was right, and the right thing to do when someone says something true is to let it be true. No, she said. You can't have those back. She held her own cup. But you're on that land now, and so is Clara, and the fence posts are still in the ground. She paused. The years that come from here are yours. Frank was quiet. That's a better thing to say than most people would say, he said. I've had practice, she said, figuring out what's recoverable and what isn't. Not a comfortable calculation, but it's the honest one. He nodded slowly. He drank his coffee. He went home to Clara and the land that was theirs again. It was a November evening, 2 years after Mabel had first walked through the door of the Copper Kettle in torn boots and a soaked coat, that a young woman came through the door of Iron Creek's kitchen. Not the front door, the kitchen door, which opened directly from the yard and was the door that people who worked or knew the place used without thinking about it. The young woman clearly did not know the place because she knocked twice before opening it and stood in the threshold looking around with a particular expression of someone who had run out of options and was not sure this one would work either. She was perhaps 22, thin in the way that was not a choice. Her boots were muddy, and her coat was not warm enough for November, and she had a cloth bag over one shoulder that looked nearly empty. Mabel was at the stove. She turned around when she heard the knock. She looked at the young woman in the doorway, and she saw the thing she recognized, not the muddy boots or the inadequate coat, but what was underneath those. The specific, controlled exhaustion of someone who had been managing a difficult situation for too long and was very close to the point where managing it required more than they had left. She had looked exactly like that 2 years ago. She might have looked worse. Come in, Mabel said. Close the door. You're letting the cold in. The young woman came in and closed the door and stood just inside it, which was what people did when they were somewhere new and uncertain, kept themselves close to the exit. I heard in town that you sometimes need help, the young woman said. Her voice was careful, the particular carefulness of someone who had rehearsed this. I can cook, I can clean, I learn fast, I don't need much. Sit down, Mabel said. The young woman looked at her. Chair there, Mabel said. Sit down, she sat. Mabel took a bowl from the shelf and filled it from the pot on the stove beef stew, which was what Tuesdays were, had been since the first weeks at Iron Creek, and set it on the table in front of her. The young woman looked at the bowl. I haven't said what I can pay, she said. You haven't eaten, Mabel said. Eat first, I was going to ask. I know what you were going to ask, Mabel said, and we'll talk about it. But you're going to eat something first, because nothing makes sense on an empty stomach, and I've spent a lot of time learning that the hard way. The young woman looked at the stew. She picked up the spoon. Ate. Mabel sat down across from her with her own bowl and ate too, and they were quiet for a few minutes in the way that people could be quiet, when the quiet was simply the space between two humans eating at the end of a long day. Calder came in from the barn at 6:30, which was when he always came in, stamping his boots at the door and hanging his coat on the hook that had been his hook, since before Mabel arrived and was still his hook, next to hers. He stopped when he saw the young woman at the table. He looked at Mabel. She looked at him. He pulled out the chair at the end of the table and sat down, and Mabel got up and filled a third bowl without being asked, and he thanked her the way, he thanked her briefly, without performance, and he started eating. What's your name? He asked the young woman. She told him. It was a plain name, a practical name, the kind that belonged to someone who had been raised without much room for decoration. Where from? She told him that too, far enough that she hadn't come here with a plan. She had come here the way people came to places when the places they'd been stopped working, by following the distance between where things were bad and somewhere that might be different. Calder looked at his bowl. "We could use help with the provision packing," he said. "And someone to help Estelle with the morning deliveries." Mabel said nothing. He looked at her sideways. "If Mabel thinks you'd be a fit." The young woman looked at Mabel. Mabel looked at her, not the inventory-taking look, not the calculation. Just looking, the way she had wanted to be looked at once, in a cold cafe in a winter that had seemed like it would never end. "Can you start Thursday?" Mabel said. The young woman said yes. She said it quickly, before anything could change, the way people said yes to things when they had been waiting for something to say yes to. After supper, Mabel showed her the small back room that was clean and warm, and had a window that seated properly in its frame. She showed her where the lamps were and where the extra blankets were kept, and what time the kitchen started in the morning. The young woman stood in the middle of the small room and looked around at it with an expression that Mabel recognized down to the bone, the particular, guarded relief of someone who has been moving for a long time and has just, possibly, stopped. "Thank you," the young woman said. "I'll work hard." I know," Mabel said. "Get some sleep." She went back to the kitchen. Calder was at the table with the account book, which was where he usually was at this hour, doing the numbers that were his portion of the shared work. He looked up when she came in. "She reminds you of someone," he said. It was not a question. Mabel sat down across from him and pulled the account book toward her to look at the column he'd been working on. "The numbers in this column don't add up," she said. "I know. I was about to fix it." She picked up the pencils. "She reminds me of me," she said, "a little." He said nothing. "Not entirely," she said. "She's younger, and she came here on purpose, which I didn't exactly do." She looked at the column. "The look, that particular look, the one you had. The one anyone has when they've been managing something alone for too long, and they've run out of ways to keep managing it." She made the correction in the column. "It's not a rare look. More people walk around with it than you'd think." Quiet for a moment. "Do you still have it?" he said. She looked up at him. She thought about the question honestly, the way she thought about things, turning it over, looking at it from the angles that mattered. "No," she said, "not the same way. What changed?" She looked at the kitchen around her, at the cast iron skillet, the cracked one, repurposed, sitting on the shelf where she kept the things that still had uses. At the account books lined up with the precision she'd established in the first weeks, and that had been maintained because the system worked. At the hook by the door where her coat hung next to his. "I stopped being alone in it," she said. "That's most of it." She paused. "And I stopped believing that being alone in it was just the price of being who I am." He held her gaze. "It wasn't," he said. "I know that now." She looked back at the account book. "It took a while. Most true things do," he said. She made another correction in the column. He was right, and she knew he was right, and that was the thing she had come to understand over the 2 years at Iron Creek, that being right about something was only the beginning of knowing it. The knowing, the real kind that lived in the body and changed how you moved through a room, took time and evidence, and the repeated daily experience of a thing being different from what you'd expected it to be. She had expected to be alone. She had arranged herself for that. She had built the habits and the compensations, and the 3 times checking into such a thorough structure that being alone had come to feel not like a condition, but like a characteristic, something that was just part of what she was. And then a man had pushed a bowl of stew across a table and put on his hat, and she had sat in a drafty chair and eaten someone else's supper, and something had shifted in a direction she hadn't been looking. The world did not change for that. Cedar Mercy was still Cedar Mercy, with its gossip and its red kerchief cowboys and its Gerald Petches who signed papers they shouldn't have signed. Crowell had happened. The blizzard had happened. The long, careful work of building a case that someone with legal standing would actually look at that had happened. All of it, and it had been hard in the specific, unglamorous way that real things were hard. Not the dramatic hard that resolved cleanly, but the grinding hard that required you to get up the next day and do the next thing. She had done the next thing. She had kept doing the next thing. And here she was, at a kitchen table in Wyoming with an account book that didn't quite add up, and a husband who was waiting without impatience to find the error, and a young woman asleep in the back room who had arrived with mud on her boots and nothing much else, and been told to sit down and eat first. Here she was. It was not the life she had been careful enough not to plan for. It was something she had not known how to want, and then slowly, through the evidence of daily things, had learned. That seemed worth knowing. Not as a lesson you could hand someone. You couldn't hand it to the young woman in the back room and have it mean what it meant. She would have to find it the way Mabel had found it, through whatever came next for her. Whatever hard and ordinary accumulation of days brought her to the moment when she understood what she was actually capable of and stopped apologizing for the space she took up. All Mabel could do was give her the bowl of stew and the room that was warm and the job on Thursday morning. The same things that had been given to her once in a different form. She found the error in the account column and corrected it and set down the pencil. "Done," she said. Calder leaned over and looked at the correction. "I would have found it," he said. "I know," she said. "I found it faster." He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "You always do," and it was not a complaint. She closed the account book. Outside, the November wind moved across the Wyoming plains the way it always had, indifferent and cold, and entirely unconcerned with what happened beneath it. Inside, the stove held its heat. The lamp above the table burned with the clean, steady quality of a lamp that has been properly tended. Mabel Flint sat in her kitchen at the end of a Tuesday and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a thing she had not always been able to do. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was a life imperfect, ongoing, full of columns that didn't add up, and cows that needed checking, and young women arriving in muddy boots with nowhere else to go. It was exactly, precisely the right kind of life. And she had built it, alongside a man who understood what equal standing meant, with cracked hands and 31 cents, and the stubborn, unfashionable habit of looking at numbers until they told the truth.